Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never practice nunchucks in a crowded room. Never eat chole before a road trip. Always take your shirt off before you iron it. Don't take a call near a swimming pool. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
The stench overwhelmed the socialist sensibilities of Indian nationalism's English auntie. They are essentially an unclean race, the scholar and activist Beatrice Webb confided to her diary as she travelled through late imperial China in 1911. Following visits to the homes of male sex workers, she lamented China's, and I quote, rottenness of physical and moral character. The vicious femininity of men's faces, it seemed to her, provided evidence of rampant, widespread sodomy. Their constitution seems devastated by drugs and abnormal sexual indulgence, Webb raged. A horrid race. Much later, historian Tom Buchanan records, the philosopher Bertrand Russell explained why Webb, a pacifist and passionate advocate of home rule for India, fell in love with militarist, empire-worshipping Japan instead of China. There were no lavatories at the railway stations in China. This week, Xi Jinping, leader of a new China with state-of-the-art railway stations and sparkling clean toilets, and police who are stamping out homosexuality, is in France, hoping to convince increasingly skeptical Europeans of the value of their relationship. 80 years ago, France had established diplomatic relations with Beijing, a decade and a half before former American Secretary of State Henry Kissinger's famous secret diplomacy opened the West's doors to the People's Republic. Xi is hoping France will again open its doors. Like many other countries in Asia, India is watching anxiously, concerned that its most important strategic partner in Europe shouldn't be seduced. France's President Emmanuel Macron has been telling Xi that he expects China to end its economic and military support for Russia. Xi has responded testily so far, saying China is not the origin of this crisis, nor a party to it, nor a participant. This tension is good news for India, except that New Delhi is also drawing criticism for helping to underwrite that very war. Europe, moreover, is deeply divided on confronting China. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz seemed unwilling to press the superpower either on trade disputes or geopolitics during a visit to Beijing last month. To make things even worse, there's growing concern in European capitals over what is sometimes perceived to be a tide of illiberalism in India. There's an urgent need for New Delhi to engage European capitals more energetically if the debate on China is to tip India's way. Early in 1964, China-backed North Vietnam had defeated the South in a series of battles, and the United States was preparing to step up direct military involvement. Then French President Charles de Gaulle ordered his information minister Alain Peyrefitte to engage China on the basis of this prescient analysis. China's means are enormous, de Gaulle said. It is not excluded that in the next century it will become once again the dominant global power. French recognition of the People's Republic of China, de Gaulle argued, would, I quote, move an enormous rock with a simple lever. European powers on either side of the Iron Curtain, historian Wojtek Masny has recorded, had been deeply alarmed by the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. They realized how close the world had come to a nuclear war between the superpowers, with no influence over its course or direction. Even though it supported the Soviet Union as the crisis developed, scholar Enrico Maria Fardella writes, Beijing shared these worries. It publicly accused Moscow of adventurism for having placed the missiles in Cuba and capitulationism for agreeing to pull them out in the face of an American ultimatum. France historian Garrett Martin explains drew two important lessons from the 1962 crisis. First, it realized neither superpower wanted war, which opened up the possibility of an independent peace at some stage with Moscow. The second lesson was that the US would not risk nuclear war to defend Europe, which made it important for France to deepen its strategic autonomy and independent nuclear deterrent capabilities. To de Gaulle, Garrett notes, the nation, rather than the ideological bloc, was re emerging as the central element in geopolitics. Thus, China and India were at war, unrelated to superpower bloc politics, de Gaulle told a cabinet meeting in November 1962. That China and the Soviet Union were also locked in conflict, though they were ideological co travelers, at least ostensibly. France became increasingly committed to pursuing an independent strategic policy. In 1963, thus, France rejected offers of state of the art Polaris missiles from the United States, an offer that was made in return for France agreeing to join a multilateral force of nuclear armed submarines and warships, which were to have been jointly crewed by North Atlantic Treaty Organization troops. Even though de Gaulle's hopes of building an alternate French-German strategic alliance were thwarted, he had another card up his sleeve to grow French autonomy. Edgar Faure, essayist, historian, and former French Prime Minister, arrived in Beijing in the winter of 1963, armed with a sealed letter from de Gaulle. Later, in a letter dispatched by a diplomatic courier from New Delhi, he told de Gaulle that France was seen as a potential supporter of China among the non-socialist powers. Zhou Enlai, the former premier of the People's Republic of China, and Foreign Minister Chen Yi spent an entire evening briefing Faure justifying the war with India, which had irked both the United States and the Soviet Union. The meeting ended with an agreement on resuming diplomatic relations between France and China and recognition of the claims of the People's Republic to a seat at the United Nations. Less than a year later, France would make its recognition public, stunning the United States. France was, of course, not the first Western power to engage China. The Labour government in the United Kingdom granted it recognition in 1950, following Norway, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden. The United Kingdom hoped to protect its trade interests in China as well as its position in Hong Kong. However, feuds over the UK's relationship with Taiwan obstructed a full diplomatic relationship, and the outbreak of war in Korea sabotaged the relationship even more. Labour politicians, however, made brave efforts to sustain dialogue with China. Member of Parliament Barbara Castle, Buchanan writes, visited a cooperative farm. I was taken to a shed full of pigs and hay and given a pot. The women stood around while I had my pee, she was later to recall. Those toilets again. Efforts to build a trade relationship between the UK and China, Buchanan has recorded, continued to grow because of this sustained engagement. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan's government unilaterally relaxed trade and restrictions, and by the early 1960s, British firms had begun to export tractors and industrial equipment to China. The death of the Chinese ruler Mao Zedong in 1976, historian David Shambaugh writes, opened the path to a further relationship between Europe and China. From 1975 to 1980, China dispatched dozens of inspection and shopping missions to NATO member states. People's Liberation Army personnel were shown around important NATO bases and introduced to defense industrialists. China's energetic backing for containing the Soviet Union led to it being wryly referred to as the 16th member of NATO. Even though the 1989 slaughter of students at Tiananmen Square led to sanctions barring weapons exports to China, the economic relationship between Europe and China continued to thrive. The European Union is today collectively the largest importer of goods from China, ahead of the United States, and the third largest exporter to it. Xi's mission is to ensure that this situation, this trade relationship, is unaffected by China's deepening conflict with the United States. France and India have long nurtured their strategic relationship, from equipping the Indian Air Force and Navy to developing the technical foundations of the Research and Analysis Wing. Paris has been among New Delhi's most trusted partners together with Israel and Russia. Backing from Paris was critical to India emerging from sanctions imposed after the nuclear weapons tests in Pokhran. And the two countries collaborate closely in the Western Indian Ocean and beyond, scholars David Brewster and Frederick Graer have noted. Yet, India's economy is nowhere near as enmeshed with Europe as that of China. And even though Belt and Road investments are losing some of their sheen in some European countries, the sheer scale of investment and trade China brings to the table makes it impossible to ignore. Europeans know, most important, that China has real influence over Russia's conduct. To fully capitalize on the rupture that's opened up between China and Europe over Ukraine, New Delhi needs to speed up its own long stalled negotiations on free trade with the continental bloc. Earlier this year, India signed a similar deal with four non European states, but the big prize needs to be secured as soon as possible. India also needs to resolve the problematic question of its own position on the Ukraine war, as well as its long term relationship with Russia. Xi hasn't walked away from Europe with a win in hand, but his visit will almost certainly ignite arguments about the continent's geopolitical future. India should learn from China's long patient engagement with Europe and step up its own efforts to be heard. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm contributing editor at ThePrint. Thank you for watching this episode of Security Code.